and there was a certain relation and resemblance in their stiffened walk, poor clothing, and dumb, imploring, empty hands. The spectacle Garland continued was something tremendous, something far-reaching. The movement it represented had the majesty, if not the volcanic energy, of the rise of the peasants in Vendee. In places like North Carolina where that worked, we would be remiss, again, to acknowledge that it was not forever. It was several years. And, of course, what happened was an armed mob of white supremacist Democrats and the KKK pretty much came in and arrested and assassinated and race rioted. Of course, not to say that there was more than one side. Like, it was a white attack on, like, defenseless black people. And the government was killed. The local KKK Grand Wizard was put in as mayor, and that was that. So that kind of had an unhappy ending, but it showed really what they were trying to achieve, especially there in Wilmington, North Carolina. So if you want to, there's definitely some further reading to be done there, but it is definitely proof in the pudding of how important to the populace of the time and the populace of now that this racial unity, at least along class lines, was. So the Colored Farmers Alliance was the name of the group that organized black farmers alongside the whites-only Southern Farmers Alliance. Leaders of the Colored Alliance were essential in launching the People's Party. In some respects, were well ahead of their white brethren with calling for a third party. But black populism, as it is now called, was ultimately a fruitless effort. Everywhere in the South, the Pops hit the wall of violence and vote fraud that blocked the progress of anyone who challenged the white solidarity. When the new party made its debut in Southern elections of 1892, black voters were attacked, and a number of them were murdered. A direct reflection, according to a recent study of black populism, of the political threat posed to the Democratic Party by the coalition of black and independent white voters. Violence of this kind continued here and across the South until populism was completely vanquished. Nor was the commitment to equality professed by so many white populists truly sincere. Some of them turned out to be just as committed to white supremacy as were the Southern Democrats they meant to defy. Many others thought racism and segregation were grounded in science, and later on, once populism had begun to weaken, the same Tom Watson who wrote such admirable words in 1892 reemerged as one of the nation's most notorious racists, producing, according to historian Woodward, a stream of tirades against his one-time allies of the Negro race, and said that they were matchless in their, and the tirades were, at least, matchless in their malevolence. The point here is not something precise accounting of the populist, some precise accounting of the populist records on race. Summary, they meant well but didn't deliver. The critical thing to understand for present purposes is that populists were not the great villains of the era's racist system. That dishonor went to the movement's arch enemies, the Southern Democratic Party leaders, who were absolutely clear in their commitment to white supremacy. And of course, there were plenty of white racists all around. But the whole point here is, with racial unity and the organization of poor people, regardless, the Rainbow Coalition, as Jesse Jackson kind of talked about, you see that same principle all throughout American history. Like, this was kind of one of the first attempts of it possibly trying to maybe work, but again, it wasn't as successful as it should have been. Shockingly, on immigration, the People's Party was of two minds. In its 1892 Omaha platform, like the platforms of the two major parties, it opposed pauper immigration on the grounds that it crowded out wage earners. The man the party chose as presidential candidate, however, was a forthright supporter of open immigration, demanding in stormy populist style, "Are we still in an asylum for the oppressed of all nations, or are we about to become the policemen for the monarchs and despots of the old world, a despicable international slave catcher under the worldwide fugitive slave law, engaged in the business of arresting and returning to their cruel taskmasters the poor slaves who are fleeing hither to become citizens and to escape from hopeless conditions?" So, again, we do have a little bit of a contradiction there as well. Towards immigrants themselves, the People's Party was remarkably open. A granular investigation of the attitudes of the Kansas Popular Party populists toward immigrants found precisely the opposite of what present-day theorists always insist is the case with populism. Kansas in the 1890s was a state filled with just arrived people, and the populists competed vigorously for their votes. Populist office holders, meanwhile, came from Ireland, Germany, Sweden, and so on. As it happens, there was an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic hate group at work in the 1890s, but it just wasn't called populism, or the Populist Party, was the American Protective Association, and its political organization through which it preferred to do its work was the norm-defending organization known as the Republican Party. Here is how the populist candidates regarded the APA as laid down in a resolution adopted nearly unanimously, according to the historian who discovered it at the party's state convention in 1894. Resolved that the People's Party, as its name implies, is the party of the people and hence the enemy of oppression and tyranny in any form, and we do most emphatically condemn such conduct as unchristian, un-American, and is totally opposed to the spirit of the Constitution of our country, and we pledge our best efforts to defeat such organizations and to protect as far as we are able every individual of every nationality, religious creed, and political belief in his sacred right to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience. So again, literally just saying in a big way that they were against the kind of oppression and tyranny of all people, but there were, very kind of similar to the race thing, there were some anti-immigrant people. So here is, again, to go back to the anti-populist here, what they say is what makes populism truly dangerous is that it refuses to acknowledge the hierarchy of meritocratic achievement. In its deep regard for the wisdom of the common person, it rejects more qualified leaders, which is to say, the expert class. And this is where we kind of get into the funny, like, Atlantic stuff of, like, we've overdosed on democracy. Like, people have taken it too far. We need to give the elite some more power. And, of course, the election of Trump, with its implicit rebuff of the Ivy League approach of the Obama years and Clintonism and all that, inflated this particular fear into a kind of national nightmare. A man of remarkable ignorance about our system of government has been placed in charge of that system. A cartoon of the New Yorker captured the absurdity with a scene of airline passengers in a populist mutiny of their own, writing, "These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us," bellows one of them. "Who thinks I should fly the plane? If the elites go down, we're all in trouble," warned a headline in Boston Globe. David Brooks informed the readers of the New York Times that populism is the word that we use to describe the hatred of excellence by the mediocre. Tom Nichols, a professor for the Naval War College, announced in Foreign Affairs that America lost faith in expertise due to a psychological syndrome in which stupid people are unaware of their own limitations, while fine scholarly people are peer-reviewed and know how to avoid confirmation bias. For good measure, he equated populism with a celebration of ignorance. Understanding recent history is a showdown between peer-reviewed expertise and mass ignorance at the core of anti-populist tradition. So that's pretty much what they see it as. The dumb rubes, literally. They're telling you, the dumb rubes don't deserve power. That is the core of the anti-populist position, and therefore it is pretty unpopular, because when they talk about the dumb rubes, they mean a lot of people. So voters are very ignorant, and always have been, right? The political scientist Jonathan Rauch and Benjamin Wittes in a 2017 paper, "More Professionalism, Less Populism." I was like, come on. Therefore, the two argue, the populist goal of increasing public participation is inherently wrong-headed. Experts are the ones we should be empowering. Like it or not, the two experts write, most of what government does simply must be decided by specialists and professionals. Quoting one of their professional peers, they conclude that we must have a new professional class to set the agenda. This recurring nightmare will encounter throughout this book the horror of the populist anti-intellectualist running rampant throughout the pages of some of our most elite newspapers. In its hyper-democratic folly, experts agree. Populism believes that one person's ideas are just as good as another's, and hence it refuses to recognize learning or accomplishment. As a British politician put it before the Brexit vote, people in this country have had enough of experts. Populism is the mob running wild on the streets of Washington, bellowing for beer and cheap gasoline. Meritocracy, meanwhile, is the populism diametric opposite. The mind that must rule is the corpulent political body of America. Meritocracy is ruled by well-graduated people who have dutifully climbed every ladder, rung every bell, and been rewarded for their excellence with their present high stations. Yes, meritocracy is an elitist system, but the only alternative to it is the fragile bureaucracy of, say, the State Department in the hands of a blundering dunce who can't find Pakistan on a map. So, was it true? Were populists and real people too stupid to have every power and really control the mechanisms of their own life? Well, no. The real problem with populism, with all genuine populists and populist movements over the year, was the opposite. The ordinary people, again, this was the problem for the populists, the owners, the business class here. The problem for them was that the ordinary people had come to understand their interests all too well and were now acting upon that knowledge. Populism was a movement of books and newspapers, of reformers who believed in what what historian Postel calls progress through education, with the earnest faith of the 19th century uplifter. Think of the vast encampments of rural families listening to lectures from the Farmers Alliance, or of the lending libraries the Alliance set up all over the place, or the universities that leading populists helped establish. There were populist newspapers, hundreds of them, started in order to contest the mainstream media of the day and to spread the gospel of reform. In their pages, the reader would find cheap left-wing books for sale. The editor of the famous Appeal to Reason newspaper, for example, dispensed political tracts under the headline, "Books Laboring People Should Read. To remain ignorant is to remain a slave." So, there was this whole little media market there, out to educate people in a time where information did not nearly travel as fast as it did. Populism did not call, also not surprisingly, for rule by experts. Populism was about mass enlightenment, not empowerment of a clique of foundation favorites or Ivy League grads. On the money question, Charles Postel calls us that Pops really thought it could and must be understood by the people whose business interests and livelihoods were affected by it, and more people should know the mechanisms and workings of their own life. That is really what true populism wants to know. What populism is the people kind of knocking at the door of power and saying, let us in. And sometimes it comes through a little bit harsher than others. But it's not about, destroying the elite, per se. It's kind of making everyone a little bit more equal. And this kind of literacy movement that we saw throughout the 1890s and the early populist movement, some of the economic downtimes of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, is that people wanted to inform each other. They wanted to spread the word, and that is how that's how they made each other's lives better, and that's also probably how they got a lot of sense of community and unification in an organization. That collective coming together, that collective education of the group, is what made populism so strong and what allowed their ideas to grow so fast. So, no, it was not that people hated learning or hated elites. Well, of course they did hate elites, but they didn't hate them because of the fact that they were quote-unquote experts. The thing was, the elites hated them because they knew too much, and they were learning, and they were expanding their knowledge. The only problem was they just got the idea that those elites, those smart Ivy League educated people in the ivory towers, may not be as good as they all wanted us to think that they were. That concludes our two-part series on populism. Thank you so much for Thomas Frank there for a lot of the text of the show. You can check out that excerpt online, but you should definitely go and purchase the full book. Very, very good book. Of course, Populism. The People Know. Thank you so much for listening to this season. Our last episode of our first season was, of course, this one. We will be back for a second season, but, of course, first, there will be a new season of That's Interesting, our culture show coming soon. But we will be back with the second season of this one. So don't delete this off your feed. Stay subscribed. But we will have to put out That's Interesting first before we get back to this. It's been an absolute pleasure this year to talk to you a little bit about things you may not know about our history.